The maintenance lift shuddered to a stop at the 73rd floor, its metal doors grinding open with a sound like grinding teeth. Rose stepped out into the corridor, her cleaning supplies rattling in the cart she pulled behind her. She had been working in the Drakmari Palace for 8 months now, ever since the border raid that destroyed her colony ship. The dragon-like aliens had taken the survivors as servants, considering humans barely intelligent enough for basic labor. This floor was different from the others she cleaned. The walls here were made of pure crystal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The air felt thicker, more important somehow. Rose had never been this high in the palace before. Usually she worked in the lower levels where the kitchens and storage areas were located. But today, the regular maintenance staff was sick with some kind of alien flu, and she had been sent to cover their duties. The work order on her tablet was simple enough. Clean the automated systems on floor 73, check the air filters, and make sure everything was running properly. What it did not mention was why this floor seemed so empty and quiet compared to the rest of the bustling palace. Rose pushed her cart down the hallway, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished stone floor. The Drakmari liked things quiet. They were a proud species, tall and scaled, with wings that could carry them through the air and strength that could crush steel. Their king, Thorvain, was said to be the mightiest warrior in their history. The humans who served in the palace rarely saw him, but they could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on everything. As she worked her way through the corridor, checking the wall-mounted air recyclers, Rose noticed something strange. One of the automated service panels was blinking red instead of the usual green. She approached it and saw that the system had completely shut down. The display showed error messages in the flowing Drakmari script that she could barely read. Following the maintenance cables, Rose traced the problem to a large door at the end of the corridor. The door was different from the others she had seen. It was larger, made of the same crystal as the walls and covered with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the light. More importantly, it was slightly open, which explained why the environmental systems were failing. Rose knocked gently on the door and waited. No answer came. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. According to her training, she was supposed to report system failures immediately and wait for a Drakmari technician to handle them. But the error messages were getting worse, and she could feel the air getting stale. Someone inside might be in trouble. She pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The room beyond was enormous, easily the size of the main dining hall she cleaned every day. But where the dining hall was full of tables and chairs and the noise of hundreds of aliens eating and talking, this room was almost empty. Sunlight streamed in through massive windows that looked out over the city below. In the center of the room was a small bed, some scattered toys, and what looked like a floating chair that had tipped over. And on the floor, trying unsuccessfully to crawl toward a water pitcher that had fallen just out of reach, was a child. Rose had never seen a young Drakmari before. The adults were impressive and frightening, with their scales and sharp teeth and eyes that seemed to look right through humans like they were nothing. But this child was different. He was small, maybe 6 or 7 years old by human standards, with silver-blue scales that caught the light like jewels. His wings, which should have been powerful enough to lift him into the air, hung limp and useless at his sides. His legs, which should have carried him across the room with ease, lay still beneath him. The child looked up when Rose entered, and she saw tears on his face. His eyes were the same golden color as the adult Drakmari, but they held something she had never seen in an alien before. Fear, loneliness, and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come to help. Rose forgot about the cleaning supplies. She forgot about the rules that said humans were not supposed to touch the royal family without permission. She forgot about the punishment for entering restricted areas. All she saw was a child who needed help. She crossed the room quickly and knelt beside him. The child flinched at first, probably expecting to be hurt or ignored like always. But Rose moved slowly and gently, the way she would with any frightened child. She reached out and carefully lifted him, surprised by how light he was. His scales were warm under her hands, and she could feel his heart beating fast with fear and excitement. "It's okay," she said softly, even though she knew he probably could not understand her human language. "I'm here to help." She carried him to his bed and set him down gently, then retrieved the water pitcher and brought it to him. The child drank eagerly, his golden eyes never leaving her face. When he was finished, he said something in the musical Drakmari language. Rose did not understand the words, but the tone was clear. He was saying thank you. Rose looked around the room and began to understand. This was a prison, but not the kind with bars and locks. This was the kind of prison made of shame and tradition. The child was hidden away here because his people saw his paralyzed legs and useless wings as a weakness that brought dishonor to their family. He had been left alone with only machines for company, slowly dying of loneliness. She spent the next hour with him, playing simple games with the toys scattered around the room. She showed him how to stack blocks in different ways, how to make patterns with colored stones, and how to play peekaboo behind her hands. The child laughed for the first time in months, maybe years. The sound was like music, high and sweet and full of joy. But their time together came to an end when the crystal door burst open and King Thorvain himself strode into the room. Rose had never seen the Drakmari king up close before. He was enormous even by the standards of his people. His scales were deep red like dried blood, and his wings cast shadows across the entire room. His eyes blazed with a fury that made the air itself seem to burn. Behind him came a dozen palace guards, their weapons already drawn. The child, who had been playing happily just moments before, went very still and quiet. Rose could feel him trembling in her arms. "How dare you," the king said, his voice like thunder rolling across mountains. "How dare a human slave touch royal blood?" Rose knew she was going to die. The Drakmari had very clear laws about humans who overstepped their bounds. But as she looked down at the child in her arms, she realized she did not regret what she had done. For 1 hour, this little prince had been happy. For 1 hour he had felt cared for and loved. That was worth any punishment they could give her. The king stepped forward, his massive claws extended, ready to end her life with a single swipe. But then something unexpected happened. The child spoke. His voice was small and weak, but it carried clearly across the silent room. He said something in rapid Drakmari, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement and fear. The king stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening in shock. The guards lowered their weapons slightly, confusion written across their scaled faces. Rose did not understand what the child had said, but she could see its effect. The king's rage faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. He stared at his son, then at Rose, then back at his son again. The child continued speaking, pointing at Rose and then at himself, his words growing stronger with each sentence. Rose caught a few words she recognized from her basic language training. Friend, play, happy, help. When the child finished speaking, the room fell into complete silence. The king stood frozen, his mind clearly struggling to process what he had just witnessed. His son, who had not spoken a word to anyone in 2 years, had just given a speech defending a human slave. Finally, the king found his voice. "Take the human to the holding cells," he commanded his guards. "I will decide her fate tomorrow." As the guards moved forward to arrest her, Rose gently set the child back down on his bed. He reached out for her, his golden eyes filling with tears again, but she was already being pulled away. The last thing she heard as they dragged her from the room was the sound of the child calling her name. Somehow, in their hour together, he had learned to say Rose in his musical voice. As the crystal door closed behind her, Rose realized that everything had changed. The child had spoken for the first time in years, and he had spoken to defend her. Whatever happened next, she had made a difference in his life, and perhaps, without knowing it, he had begun to change everything else as well. The holding cell smelled like fear and old metal. Rose sat on the hard bench, her wrists still sore from the restraints they had used to drag her down here. She had been in the cell for 2 days now, waiting for King Thorvain to decide whether she would live or die. The guards brought her water and some kind of bitter alien food twice a day, but no one spoke to her. No one even looked at her. She spent the time thinking about the child, Prince Aldrich. That was his name she had learned from whispered conversations between the guards. They seemed almost afraid to say it out loud, as if speaking about the paralyzed prince would bring bad luck. Rose wondered if he was okay, if he was eating properly, if anyone was taking care of him now that she was gone. On the third morning, the cell door opened with a clang that echoed through the stone corridors. But instead of guards coming to take her to her execution, a young Drakmari female entered. She wore the robes of a palace official, and her scales were a pale green color that marked her as one of the educated class. "You are the human who touched Prince Aldrich," she said in accented but clear human language. Rose nodded, not sure what else to say. I am Vera, advisor to the king. His Majesty has decided to hold a formal hearing instead of simply executing you. This is very unusual. Normally, humans who break the laws about royal contact are killed immediately. Why is this different? Rose asked. Vera hesitated, her golden eyes showing something that might have been confusion or even respect. Because the prince has not stopped asking for you. Every day since you were taken away, he has asked when his friend Rose will come back. Yesterday, he refused to eat until someone promised to bring you to see him. This morning, he spoke in the formal throne room for the first time in his life. Rose felt her heart skip. He spoke in front of others? He demanded to know where you were and why you had been taken away from him. The entire court was shocked. Many of them had never even heard his voice before. Vera paused, studying Rose with curious eyes. What did you do to him? I played with him, Rose said simply. I treated him like a normal child. Normal? Vera's voice rose in surprise. But he is paralyzed. His wings do not work. In our culture, such weakness is a sign of spiritual corruption. The prince has been kept away from others to prevent his shame from spreading. Rose felt anger rise in her chest, but she tried to keep her voice calm. He's not shameful. He's just different. Where I come from, we have children with all kinds of physical challenges. They can still live full, happy lives if people give them the chance. Vera shook her head. Impossible. Physical strength is everything to the Drakmari. Without it, what purpose does life have? Maybe that's something you need to learn about, Rose said quietly. Before Vera could respond, more footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The guards had arrived to take Rose to the throne room. As they walked through the palace corridors, Rose noticed something different about the way people looked at her. Instead of the usual indifference or disgust, she saw curiosity in their eyes. Word of what had happened with the prince was spreading. The throne room was enormous, with a ceiling that stretched up so high it disappeared into shadows. Hundreds of Drakmari nobles filled the space, their scales gleaming in the light from massive crystal chandeliers. At the far end of the room, King Thorvain sat on a throne made from what looked like a single enormous gem. His red scales seemed to glow with inner fire, and his presence filled the room like a living force. But Rose's attention was caught by something else. At the base of the throne, in a floating chair that hummed quietly with power, sat Prince Aldrich. He looked so small next to his father, but his golden eyes were bright and alert. When he saw Rose, his face lit up with joy. Rose, he called out in his clear musical voice. The word echoed through the throne room, and Rose heard several nobles gasp in surprise. Apparently, many of them had never heard the prince speak before either. King Thorvain raised one massive hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the huge room. Human slave Rose, you are accused of touching royal blood without permission, entering restricted areas, and corrupting a member of the royal family. These crimes normally carry a sentence of immediate death. Rose felt her knees shake, but she forced herself to stand straight. I understand, Your Majesty. However, the king continued, circumstances have made this case unusual. My son has spoken for the first time in 2 years, and he has spoken in your defense. This presents me with a dilemma. Rose noticed that the king's voice was different than it had been in the prince's room, less angry, more thoughtful, as if he had spent the past 3 days trying to understand something that did not make sense to him. Therefore, King Thorvain said, I offer you a choice. You may accept immediate execution and end this matter now, or you may accept a challenge. What kind of challenge? Rose asked. The king leaned forward on his throne. You claim that you helped my son by treating him normally. You say that humans have ways of dealing with physical weakness that we do not understand. Very well. I give you 30 galactic cycles to prove this. If you can show improvement in Prince Aldrich's condition, you will earn your freedom and the freedom of 10 other human servants. If you fail, you will die, and all humans in the palace will be sent to the mining colonies. Rose felt the weight of every human life in the palace settling on her shoulders, but when she looked at Prince Aldrich, she saw him nodding at her, his eyes full of hope and trust. I accept the challenge, she said. A murmur ran through the crowd of nobles. Some seemed excited by the unusual turn of events, while others looked scandalized that a human was being given such an opportunity. Very well, the king said. You will be given quarters near the prince's tower. You will have access to basic supplies and materials. But understand this, human. If you are simply buying time before your eventual execution, You are only prolonging your suffering. The Drekmari do not believe in miracles. Maybe it's time you learned about those too, Rose said quietly. The king's eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. We shall see. As the guards prepared to escort Rose to her new quarters, Prince Aldrich called out again. Father, may I speak with Rose now? The king hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. For a few minutes only, Rose was allowed to approach the throne. As she got closer, she could see that Prince Aldrich looked healthier than he had 3 days ago. His scales were brighter, his eyes more alert. Just having something to hope for had already begun to change him. I knew you would come back, he said in his musical voice, switching to heavily accented human language. I have been learning your words from the language computers. Rose felt tears sting her eyes. You've been studying human language? Every day since you left. I want to understand everything you can teach me. His golden eyes were serious beyond his years. Father thinks you cannot help me. But I know you can. I felt different when you were here, stronger. I'm going to try my best, Rose promised. But you have to help me. This is going to be hard work. I am not afraid of hard work, the prince said firmly. I am only afraid of being alone again. Rose reached out and gently touched his hand. His scales were warm under her fingers, and she felt him squeeze her hand in return. You're not going to be alone anymore. As she was led away to her new quarters, Rose's mind was already working. 30 galactic cycles was roughly equivalent to 3 human months. Not much time to overcome years of neglect and the prejudices of an entire civilization. But she had advantages the Drekmari did not expect. She understood adaptive technology. She knew about physical therapy, occupational therapy, and most importantly, she understood that a person's worth was not determined by their physical abilities. The Drekmari had written Prince Aldrich off as a failure because he could not fly or run like other members of his species. But Rose saw potential they had missed. The prince was intelligent, curious, and eager to learn. His upper body was actually quite strong from pulling himself around his room for years. His mind was sharp and creative, probably because he had been forced to entertain himself with limited resources. These were not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They were strengths to be developed. Her quarters were simple but comfortable, with a small workshop area where she could build whatever adaptive equipment she might need. The Drekmari had given her access to basic materials and tools, probably expecting her to fail quickly and dramatically. They were about to learn what human determination and ingenuity could accomplish when given a real challenge. Rose spent her first night planning. She sketched designs for mobility aids, exercise equipment, and educational tools. She thought about the human children she had known back home, who had faced similar challenges and overcome them. She remembered the joy and pride on their faces when they accomplished something everyone else said was impossible. By morning, she was ready to begin changing not just Prince Aldrich's life, but the entire Drekmari understanding of what strength really meant. The impossible awakening was just beginning. 20 days had passed since Rose began working with Prince Aldrich, and the changes were impossible to ignore. The prince's room, once empty except for a bed and scattered toys, now looked like a combination gymnasium, classroom, and workshop. Rose had built parallel bars from salvaged metal pipes, created weight training equipment from spare parts, and turned one wall into a massive learning board covered with maps, star charts, and strategic diagrams. But the most dramatic change was in Prince Aldrich himself. Rose watched as he pulled himself across the parallel bars she had constructed, his arms moving with strength and confidence that had not existed a month ago. His silver blue scales gleamed with sweat, and his breathing was controlled and steady. When he reached the end of the bars, he lowered himself into the mechanical wheelchair Rose had built from hovercart parts and recycled palace equipment. Again, he said in human language, which he now spoke almost fluently, I want to try the obstacle course again. Rose smiled but shook her head. You've already done it 3 times this morning. Even human athletes need rest between training sessions. But I am getting stronger every day, Aldrich protested. Yesterday I could only do the course twice before getting tired. Today I can do it 3 times. Tomorrow maybe I can do it 4 times. Strength isn't just about how many times you can do something, Rose explained, wiping his scales with a damp cloth. It's also about knowing when to rest so your body can rebuild itself. That's how muscles grow. The concept of planned rest was foreign to Drekmari culture, where strength was seen as something you either had or did not have. But Aldrich had embraced human training methods with enthusiasm that amazed even Rose. He approached physical therapy the same way he approached everything else, with fierce intelligence and determination. "Tell me about the strategic problem again," he said, wheeling himself over to the wall covered with star charts, the one about the supply convoy. Rose had been teaching him human military history and tactical thinking as part of his mental exercises. She believed that a strong mind was just as important as a strong body, and Aldrich had proven to be a brilliant student. His ability to see patterns and solve problems was extraordinary. "Remember the Earth-Mars trade war from human history?" Rose said, pointing to a diagram she had drawn. The Earth forces had stronger ships and more weapons, but the Mars colonies controlled the asteroid mining stations. How did Mars win the war? Aldrich studied the diagram for a moment, his golden eyes moving quickly across the information. They did not fight the Earth ships directly. Instead, they attacked the supply lines. The Earth ships were powerful, but they needed fuel and resources from the asteroid belt. Mars cut off the supply convoys and waited for the Earth fleet to become weak and desperate. "Exactly," Rose said, proud of how quickly he had grasped the concept. "Sometimes the smartest strategy is not to attack your enemy's strength, but to attack their weakness. Like what you did with me," Aldrich said thoughtfully. "Everyone saw my paralyzed legs as a weakness that could not be fixed. But you attacked the real weakness, which was that no one had ever tried to help me become stronger in other ways." Rose felt a warm glow of pride. In just 20 days, Aldrich had transformed from a lonely, depressed child into a confident young person, with a sharp mind and growing physical capabilities. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that there were many different kinds of strength. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the door. Rose opened it to find Vera, the pale green advisor who had first told her about the hearing. But Vera's expression was troubled, and she kept glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I need to speak with you privately," Vera said in a low voice. "There are things happening in the court that you should know about." Rose looked back at Aldrich, who was listening intently from his wheelchair. "Anything that affects me affects the prince too," she said. "He should hear this." Vera hesitated, then nodded. She entered the room and closed the door carefully behind her. "There is a growing faction among the nobles who oppose what you are doing here. They are led by General Drex, the king's military advisor. They believe that your influence over the prince is dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Rose asked. "They say that you are teaching him to think like a human instead of like a Drakmari. They point to his interest in strategy and tactics as evidence that you are trying to make him weak and cowardly." Vera's voice dropped even lower. "They are planning to petition the king to end this experiment early." Rose felt a chill of fear, but Aldrich surprised her by speaking up calmly. "What evidence do they have that I am becoming weak?" he asked. Vera blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Well, they say that true Drakmari strength comes from physical power and direct confrontation. Your focus on strategy and adaptation is seen as avoiding honorable combat." "I see," Aldrich said thoughtfully. "And when was the last time General Drex won a military victory through direct confrontation?" Vera looked uncomfortable. "It has been several years since our last major campaign." "Because direct confrontation only works when you are stronger than your enemy," Aldrich continued. "But what happens when you face an enemy who is equally strong, or when you are outnumbered, or when your supply lines are threatened?" His golden eyes were bright with the excitement of a complex problem. "Rose has been teaching me about the great military leaders of many species. The ones who won the most victories were not always the strongest. They were the ones who could adapt their strategies to overcome any challenge." Rose watched in amazement as the young prince systematically dismantled the argument against his education. In 20 days, he had not only grown physically stronger, but had developed the kind of analytical thinking that could serve him well as a future leader. "But General Drex has many supporters," Vera warned. "They believe that the traditional ways are the only correct ways. They see change as a threat to everything the Drakmari Empire stands for. Then perhaps it is time to show them what this new kind of strength can accomplish," Aldrich said quietly. Before Rose could ask what he meant, an alarm began sounding throughout the palace. It was a deep, resonant tone that seemed to make the crystal walls vibrate. Rose had never heard it before, but both Vera and Aldrich recognized it immediately. "Attack alarm," Vera said, her scales going pale with fear. "The palace is under threat." Through the massive windows of the prince's tower, they could see ships in the sky above the city. They were sleek and dark, definitely not Drakmari vessels. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers in the distance, and the sound of weapons fire echoed across the crystal spires. Who would dare attack the Drakmari homeworld? Rose asked. The Kalani rebels, Vera said grimly. They have been fighting for independence for years, but they have never been bold enough to strike at the capital before. They must be desperate. Rose watched as Drakmari military ships rose to meet the attackers, but something was wrong. The Drakmari ships were moving in predictable formation patterns, exactly the kind of rigid tactical thinking that Rose had been teaching Aldrich to overcome. The rebel ships, smaller and weaker individually, were using hit-and-run tactics to avoid direct confrontation. They are going to lose, Aldrich said quietly, studying the battle through the window. Our ships are stronger, but the rebels are using better tactics. They will pick off our forces one by one while avoiding the main fleet. Surely our military commanders know what they are doing, Vera said uncertainly. Do they? Aldrich asked. Rose, show her the diagrams of the Mars-Earth War. As Rose pulled out the strategic chart she had been using to teach Aldrich, the young prince began analyzing the battle raging outside their window. His assessment was clinical and frighteningly accurate. The Drakmari fleet was being outmaneuvered by a smaller, weaker force that understood the principles of adaptive warfare. The rebels will target our supply depot next, Aldrich predicted, pointing to a facility visible in the distance. If they can destroy our fuel reserves, our ships will be forced to land for resupply. Then they can attack them on the ground where our aerial advantage is lost. Even as he spoke, a squadron of rebel ships broke away from the main battle and headed straight for the supply depot. We have to warn someone, Vera said desperately. Who? Aldrich asked. General Drex is in command of the defense, and he would never listen to advice from a paralyzed prince and a human slave. Rose looked at the young prince in his mechanical wheelchair, his silver-blue scales gleaming with determination. In 20 days, she had watched him transform from a hidden shame into a brilliant strategist. But now he was trapped, unable to help defend his own world because the very people who should value his mind saw only his physical limitations. There has to be something we can do, she said. Aldrich was quiet for a moment, studying the battle and the diagrams Rose had created. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with quiet confidence. There is, he said, but it means taking a very big risk. And it means trusting that everything you have taught me about human ingenuity is true. Rose looked into his golden eyes and saw not a disabled child, but a future leader who had learned to see strength in places others overlooked. Tell me what you need. As explosions continued to light up the sky outside, Prince Aldrich began to outline a plan that would either save the Drakmari capital or doom them all. But for the first time since the battle began, Rose felt hope. The impossible transformation was about to be put to its ultimate test. The communication device Aldrich had built from spare parts crackled to life with static and urgent voices. Rose watched as the young prince adjusted the frequency controls with practiced ease, his enhanced upper body strength allowing him to manipulate the heavy equipment that would have been impossible for him to use just weeks ago. The voices coming through the speaker were panicked and confused. Sector 7 is lost, came General Drex's voice, strained with frustration. The rebels have destroyed 3 more supply depots. Our ships are being forced to retreat for refueling. Sir, if we could try a flanking maneuver through the asteroid field, suggested another voice, younger and less certain. Impossible, Drex snapped. Drakmari ships are not built for hiding behind rocks. We fight with honor, facing our enemies directly. Aldrich looked at Rose with an expression that was part amusement and part frustration. He is about to lose the entire battle because he refuses to adapt, the prince said quietly. The rebels are using exactly the tactics we studied. They avoid direct confrontation, strike at weak points, and disappear before our forces can respond. Rose watched through the window as another Drakmari ship limped back toward the palace, trailing smoke and sparks. The rebels had been fighting for 3 hours now, and despite having fewer ships and weaker weapons, they were winning. Can we contact the king directly? Father's in the war room with the military council, Vera said from her position near the door, where she had been watching for palace guards. But even if we could reach him, General Drex would never allow a paralyzed prince to give tactical advice. Then we don't ask permission, Aldrich said firmly. He wheeled himself over to a cabinet where Rose had stored some of her adaptive technology experiments. Inside was a small flying drone she had built to help him practice hand-eye coordination. But now he was modifying it, attaching the communication device and a small recording crystal. Rose, do you remember the lesson about asymmetric warfare? When a smaller force defeats a larger one by changing the rules of engagement, Rose replied, beginning to understand his plan. Exactly. We cannot fight General Drex's authority directly, but we can provide information to someone who can use it effectively. His golden eyes gleamed with the same intensity Rose had seen when he solved complex strategy problems. There are still field commanders out there who might listen to good advice, even if it comes from an unexpected source. The drone lifted off from the workbench with a soft hum, carrying Aldrich's tactical analysis toward the battle zone. Rose felt a mixture of pride and fear as she watched it disappear through the window. The prince had learned her lessons well, but now they were betting everything on the hope that somewhere in the Drakmari military was someone open-minded enough to listen. They did not have to wait long for an answer. Unknown tactical advisor, this is Commander Yex of the 3rd Battle Group, came a voice through the communication device. We have received your strategic assessment. The flanking route you suggested through Sector 9 is working. The rebels did not expect us to use the debris field for cover. Rose saw Aldrich's scales brighten with excitement. Someone was listening. Commander Yex. Aldrich spoke into the device, disguising his voice to sound older. The rebels are using a rotating strike pattern. They hit supply depots every 18 minutes in a clockwise sequence. If you position ships at Depot 7 and Depot 12, you can intercept their next attack wave. Understood, tactical advisor. Moving ships to those positions now. But their success was short-lived. The door to the Prince's Tower burst open, and General Drex himself strode into the room, followed by a squad of heavily armed guards. The general was enormous even by Drakmari standards, with dark red scales and scars that marked him as a veteran of many battles. His eyes blazed with fury when he saw the communication equipment. Treason, he snarled, pointing one clawed finger at Aldrich. The prince is giving information to enemies of the state. I am helping to defend our homeworld, Aldrich replied calmly, not backing down despite being surrounded by armed guards. You are undermining military command with your human corruption, Drex spat, his gaze shifting to Rose. This human witch has poisoned your mind with cowardly tactics and dishonorable strategies. The tactics are working, Aldrich pointed out. Commander Yex just reported intercepting a rebel squadron using the information I provided. One lucky guess does not excuse treason. Drex gestured to his guards. Arrest them both. The human will be executed immediately, and the prince will be confined until this battle is over. But as the guards moved forward, the communication device crackled again. Tactical advisor, this is Commander Yex. The rebel command ship has been isolated using your predicted movement patterns. We have a clear shot, but they are trying to escape through the northern trade corridor. What do you advise? General Drex hesitated, his hand raised to cut off the communication. Rose could see the conflict in his expression. His pride demanded that he silence Aldrich and maintain traditional command structure, but the battle was being won using the prince's unconventional strategies. Tell him to let the command ship escape, Aldrich said quickly, but have ships waiting at the exit point of the trade corridor. The rebels will think they are safe and drop their guard. That is when you strike. You would let enemies escape? Drex asked incredulously. I would let them think they are escaping, Aldrich corrected. Sometimes the most effective trap is the one your enemy chooses to enter willingly. The communication device confirmed Aldrich's prediction minutes later. The rebel command ship, believing it had escaped, was captured when it emerged from the trade corridor. With their leadership gone, the remaining rebel ships surrendered or fled. The battle was over. The Drakmari homeworld was safe. General Drex stood in the silence that followed, his scarred face showing the internal struggle between his prejudices and the undeniable evidence before him. The paralyzed prince he had dismissed as weak and corrupted had just saved the capital using strategies the general would never have considered. How? Drex asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. How did you know what they would do? Because Rose taught me to think like my enemies, Aldrich replied. To understand their motivations and predict their actions based on logic rather than honor. The rebels were not fighting to win glory. They were fighting to survive. Once I understood that, their tactics became predictable. Rose watched as something shifted in the general's expression. The fury was still there, but it was mixed now with confusion and perhaps a grudging respect. "These are not Drakmari ways," he said. "No," Aldrich agreed. "They are better." Before Drex could respond, King Thorvain himself appeared in the doorway. The massive ruler filled the entrance, his red scales gleaming and his presence making the already large room feel small. Behind him came the rest of the royal council, their faces showing mixtures of shock, confusion, and curiosity. "I have been listening to the military communications," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Someone calling himself tactical advisor coordinated the defense that saved our world. General Drex, I assume this was one of your commanders." Drex looked at Aldrich, then at Rose, then back at his king. Rose could see the choice forming in his mind. He could claim credit for the victory and maintain his position. He could lie about who had really provided the strategic guidance that won the battle. His pride and his prejudices urged him toward deception. Instead, he stepped aside and pointed at Aldrich. "It was the prince, your majesty," Drex said quietly. "The paralyzed prince saved us all." The throne room had never been so silent. King Thorvain stared at his son. This child he had hidden away in shame for years, trying to process the impossible reality before him. The weak prince who could not fly, who could not walk, had just demonstrated strategic brilliance that exceeded anything his military council had achieved. "How is this possible?" the king asked. Rose felt Aldrich's hand touch hers, drawing strength from their connection. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the massive room. "Because someone finally taught me that there are many kinds of strength, Father. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from being the most powerful, but from being the most adaptable." King Thorvain looked at his son, then at Rose, then at the communication equipment that had carried Aldrich's voice to the commanders who trusted his guidance. The weight of everything he had believed about strength, about weakness, about the proper order of his empire, pressed down on him like a physical force. The choice he made in the next few moments would determine not just Rose's fate, but the future of the entire Drakmari civilization. 2 years had passed since the day Prince Aldrich saved the Drakmari homeworld, and the Crystal Palace had become a very different place. Rose walked through corridors that once echoed only with the footsteps of proud Drakmari nobles, but now buzzed with the voices of humans, Kalani, and even some of the other species that had once been enemies of the Empire. The change had not come easily or quickly, but it had come nonetheless. She paused at a window overlooking the courtyard where a group of young Drakmari were learning adaptive combat techniques from human instructors. The students moved with grace and power, but they also showed the flexibility and creative thinking that had once been foreign to their species. Watching them practice, it was hard to remember a time when the Drakmari believed that strength could only come from raw physical power. "The afternoon council session is about to begin," came a familiar voice behind her. Rose turned to see Aldrich, approaching in the advanced mobility chair he had helped design. At 8 years old, he was still small by Drakmari standards, but there was nothing small about his presence. His silver-blue scales had grown brighter and stronger, and his golden eyes held the calm confidence of someone who had learned to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. Most importantly, he moved through the palace not as a hidden shame, but as the acknowledged heir to the throne. "Are you ready for this?" Rose asked, walking beside him as they made their way to the council chambers. "I have been ready since the day you first lifted me from the floor of my prison," Aldrich replied with a smile. "Today we just make it official." The council chamber had been redesigned to accommodate beings of different sizes and physical capabilities. Traditional high platforms had been replaced with modular seating that could be adjusted for anyone from tiny Kalani to massive Drakmari. At the head of the room, King Thorvain sat on a throne that was no longer elevated above everyone else, but positioned as part of a circle that included voices from across the empire. The transformation of the king himself had been perhaps the most remarkable change of all. The proud, rigid ruler who had once hidden his son in shame now actively sought out different perspectives and challenged traditional thinking at every opportunity. The process had been painful for him, requiring him to examine and abandon beliefs he had held his entire life, but the results spoke for themselves. "Citizens of the Drakmari Empire," King Thorvain began, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "We gather today to formally recognize changes that have already transformed our society. 2 years ago, our empire was built on the principle that physical strength determined worth. We believed that those who were different were somehow lesser, and we used that belief to justify conquest and domination." Rose watched as representatives from dozens of species listened intently. Many of them had been slaves or enemies just 2 years ago. Now they sat as equals, contributing their knowledge and perspectives to the governance of an empire that had once oppressed them. "We were wrong," the king continued simply. "We confused strength with brutality and power with wisdom. It took a human servant and my own son to show us that true strength comes not from what we can destroy, but from what we can build together." Aldrich had been chosen to speak next, and Rose felt a surge of pride as she watched him wheel himself to the center of the chamber. The young prince who had once been too ashamed to speak in public now commanded the attention of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "When I was very young," Aldrich began, his voice clear and strong, "I believed I was weak because I could not fly like other Drakmari. I thought my paralyzed legs made me useless, and I accepted that I would spend my life hidden away from those who mattered." He paused, his golden eyes finding Rose in the crowd. "Then someone showed me that I was not broken. I was simply different. And difference, when properly understood and developed, can become the greatest strength of all." Rose felt tears sting her eyes as she remembered the frightened, lonely child she had found in that tower room. That boy had grown into a leader who could inspire others to see past their own limitations and prejudices. "Today we make official what has already begun," Aldrich continued. "The Drakmari Empire becomes the Galactic Cooperative. Instead of ruling through conquest, we will lead through cooperation. Instead of demanding submission, we will offer partnership. And instead of seeing difference as weakness, we will celebrate it as our greatest resource." The formal votes were cast quickly and unanimously. Representatives who had once been enemies now worked together to create laws that protected the rights of all species, promoted adaptive technologies, and encouraged the kind of creative problem-solving that had saved the homeworld during the rebel attack. But for Rose, the most meaningful moment came after the session, when she found herself alone with King Thorvain in his private chambers. The massive ruler looked older than he had 2 years ago, worn down by the effort of changing not just his mind but his entire world view. But he also looked more at peace than she had ever seen him. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When I first found you with my son, I was ready to kill you for touching royal blood. I saw you as nothing more than a useful animal, barely worth the food we fed you." "You were protecting what you believed in," Rose replied. "I understand that now." "No," Thorvain shook his massive head. "I was protecting my own ignorance and pride. You saw potential in my son that I had been too blind to recognize. You gave him hope when I had given him only shame. You taught him that his worth was not determined by his physical limitations, and in doing so you taught all of us the same lesson." The king moved to the window, looking out over the bustling city below. In the distance, construction crews made up of multiple species were building new adaptive housing complexes, medical facilities designed around different physiologies, and research centers where the brightest minds from across the galaxy could work together. "Sometimes I wonder what our empire might have become if we had learned these lessons centuries ago," he mused. "How many brilliant minds did we dismiss because they came in bodies we considered inferior? How many innovations did we miss because we were too proud to listen to those we thought beneath us?" "You can't change the past," Rose said gently, "but you can shape the future." "Indeed." Thorvain turned back to her with something that might have been a smile. "Which brings me to my final request. Aldrich will need advisors when he takes the throne. People who understand that leadership is about service, not domination. People who can see strength in unexpected places." Rose felt her heart skip. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I am asking you to help us continue becoming the civilization we should have been all along," the king replied. "You have already given us more than we deserved. I would understand if you chose to return to your own people, but if you are willing, we would be honored to have you help guide this new empire." Before Rose could answer, excited voices echoed from the courtyard below. She and the king looked out to see Aldrich racing his wheelchair through an obstacle course, laughing as he maneuvered around barriers and over ramps with fluid grace. Around him, young beings from a dozen different species cheered him on. Not because he was a prince, but because he was their friend. Watching him, Rose remembered the broken child she had lifted from the floor of his prison. That simple act of compassion had set in motion changes that had transformed an entire galactic civilization. It had turned enemies into allies, slaves into citizens, and an empire built on conquest into a cooperative dedicated to mutual growth and understanding. "I'll stay," she said simply. Years later, historians would mark the day that Rose first entered Prince Aldrich's tower as the beginning of the new galactic age. They would write about the human servant whose compassion broke through alien prejudice, and the paralyzed prince who became the greatest leader his people had ever known. They would analyze the political and social changes that followed, documenting how a civilization built on dominance learned to value cooperation above conquest. But for Rose, the most important part of the story would always be much simpler than that. It was about a lonely child who needed someone to care, and a woman who could not walk away from someone who needed help. Everything else, all the grand historical changes and political transformations, had grown from that single moment when she chose to lift a fallen child. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe really was just refusing to give up on someone who needed help. And sometimes when that help was offered with genuine love and respect, it could change not just one life but an entire galaxy. The human maid had lifted the Dragon King's paralyzed child, and what happened next had indeed changed him forever. But more than that, it had changed them all.